Well, I made it for another day anyway. You can see the office is rearranged just a little bit to make room for boxes elsewhere, and we're moving forward with our transition. Hopefully, just a transition to a new house and a new location, and not the profound transition of people my age worry about. But the whole thing has been a horrifying experience, as all of you who have ever moved can easily identify. And I'm not saying that we're especially, that fate has especially singled us out, because I know everybody many times during their life goes through this stress of moving and things like that. What makes it even more sort of colorful and adds a sort of a strange dimension to it, it's very, very hot. And your mind works a little differently in the heat, which is what we're going to talk a little bit about this morning. Because what I'm going to do, uh, and I probably a year or two ago have done this in the context of the original book. I'm going to revisit uh, something that I wrote as the introduction to the Weiser book of horror and the occult. Now, it's a book that I curated, I edited it, and I introduced it. So it's my project for sure, along with the talented people at Weiser. But I took special care with the introduction, because it's really quite personal. So I thought I'd share that with you today, because it is so terribly hot, and there's aspects of life that touch upon the same triggering, emotional triggering devices that horror and the genre of horror speak to. Horror takes its time. I've got a couple of epigrams here at the very beginning of it. One from H.P. Lovecraft and one from George R.R. Martin, the inventor of or the creator of Game of Thrones. Uh, Lovecraft says the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear. And the oldest and strongest kind of fear is the fear of the unknown. Tell me about it. These facts few psychologists will dispute, and their admitted truth must establish for all time the genuineness and the dignity of the weirdly horrible tale as a literary form. Now, the one from George R.R. Martin is a scene in the Game of Thrones when old Nan, I think is her name, she's like the nurse to a prince who is sort of is sick and feeling sorry for himself, a child. And the child is at bedtime is telling her that he's so afraid, and she says, "Oh, my sweet summer child," old Nan said quietly, "what do you know of fear? Fear is for the winter, my little lord, when the snows fall 100 feet deep and the ice wind comes howling out of the north. Fear is for the long night, when the sun hides its face for years at a time, and little children are born and live and die all in darkness, while the dire wolves grow gaunt and hungry, and the white walkers move through the woods." Horror is the literature of the damned, a demon child art form conceived in the fertile depths of subconscious hell, gestated in the lonely womb of fear and despair, brought to troubled birth by the midwife of tortured obsessions, and reared to grotesque maturity in the prison asylum of a terrified imagination. Horror, to truly be horror, must be more than a frightening story. It must be a cloistered odyssey, a claustrophobic dance with madness. Above all, horror must be traumatic and a traumatic and soul-mutating spiritual experience, sublime, elegant, and terrible. Sounds disturbing, doesn't it? I hope so. Horror should be disturbing. But at first glance, classic horror seldom presents itself as the product of a disturbed mind. On the contrary, some of the best works of the genre are introduced by a narrator who seems as sane and rational as you or I. An ordinary mind which, at the moment, is merely grappling with extraordinary psychological issues with which we can all more or less identify. But beware, dear reader, your gentle empathy with the story's protagonist is a subtle poison that within a breathtakingly few paragraphs disrobes your soul and lulls you into a poppied sleep. Naked and vulnerable and now uncertain of your own sanity, horror draws you irresistibly into the mind of the main character of a nightmare. For me, or anyone who stubbornly refuses to grow up completely, literature doesn't get better than that. Okay. I'm going to read the footnote of what's coming up here because it at least appears on the surface that I'm saying disparaging remarks about Nebraska and Nebraskans. Okay. That's where I grew up. From the age of 7 to the age of 17. So here's the footnote. I said, I sincerely apologize to Nebraskans past and present who might be offended by my words. You hear that out there? Please forgive me, Nebraskans. And I ask the reader to please be mindful that my comments here about Nebraska and Nebraskans are merely giving voice to the private, personal, subjective, and immature observations of a high-strung and unhappy 9-year-old Lon Milo DuQuette. 9 years old, I think that's the golden age of horror. Okay. They do not necessarily reflect my current objective opinions of the great state of Nebraska or her remarkable and resilient citizens. I sincerely apologize to Nebraskans past and present who might be offended by my words. Okay, that's out of the way. I turned 9 years old on July of 1957. I was enduring my second melancholy summer of exile in the uncivilized wilderness of Nebraska. I realize the word exile probably sounds melodramatic, but I was a very melodramatic child in 1957, and Nebraska was for me an alien planet, cruel and hostile. I hadn't been born in Nebraska. I'd been kidnapped by my parents and taken there against my will. I was a Southern California boy, and I thoroughly enjoyed my first 7 years in that hip and sunny fairyland where movies were made, where rock and roll was evolving, and dreams and industries of the space age made us all feel like citizens of a bright and dreaming future. My family's move to Nebraska in 1955 was in my eyes a doleful exodus back to the dark ages, a trail of tears from a 20th century beach paradise to a 19th century prairie hell. Powerless to change my circumstances, I pouted and steeped in a bitter broth of self-absorbed discontentment. I hated Nebraska. I hated Nebraskans. I hated the way they talk. I hated the way they laughed about butchering animals. I hated the way they preached about their wrathful God who hates Negroes and Chinese, even though there wasn't a Negro or a Chinese person within 100 miles of our provincial town. A God who would condemn little boys to the flames of eternal torment, even for the sin of not believing in a God who hates Negroes and Chinese. Most of all, I hated the way Nebraskans, young and old, actually took smug pride in their own lack of sophistication. They wore their ingenuousness like a badge of honor and rudely ridiculed and bullied anyone who did not proudly clothe themselves with the same coarse robe of premeditated ignorance. I admit this sounds terribly unkind. Hate is a strong and unhealthy passion, especially for a 9-year-old boy. But hate springs from fear, real or imagined. And in my young mind, there was much to fear in Nebraska. Even as a youngster, I sensed a palpable darkness, a prairie madness, a nameless evil brooding just beneath the surface of the bib overalls and the cotton house dresses. A slumbering beast just waiting to be wakened by the kiss of alcohol or jealousy or greed or lust. An evil that is ever mindful that the nearest policeman is many miles away, perhaps hours. A black and primitive wickedness that takes poisonous root in the solitary psyche of those who toil alone in the earth from dawn to dusk, season after season, year after year. An evil that smothers in the heart all breath of human compassion or empathy for pain and terror they inflict daily upon the helpless beasts they breed for slaughter, or the children they breed for labor and war. A twisted and perverse evil that feeds on guilt and self-loathing. An evil that incubates in the deafening silence of sweltering summer nights or the perpetual darkness of winter, and hideously hatches like a basilisk egg into monstrous acts of rape and incest and murder and suicide. The houses themselves are possessed of a dark subconscious secrets. Indeed, they are built upon them. Unlike the sunny and uninsulated bungalows of Southern California, Nebraska houses hide their own dungeons. Large as the footprint of the house itself, these cinder block chambers, the natives call them basements. Basements offer a modicum of insulation from the frozen sod of winter and an area of damp coolness from the blistering heat of summer. Basements also provide residents a dark hole in the ground in which to cower from the whirling death clouds called tornadoes, tangible wind devils that regularly strike down from pus-green clouds and sweep across the earth, bringing grotesque death and destruction to anything and everyone in their path. Yes, there was much for a young man to fear in Nebraska. I was lonely, depressed, morose. One sweltering, humid summer morning, I became so desperately bored that I did something unthinkable for a 9-year-old boy in Nebraska. I found something to read. That morning, I lingered in my sweat-soaked bed until I knew I was alone in the house. I got up and turned on our old Raytheon television set in the living room, but could only get a scattered signal of a farm report. Like electricity and indoor toilets, television was new to rural Nebraska, and what few broadcast stations in operation there were very far away. Reluctantly, I switched off the crackling television and turned my attention to the living room bookcase. I looked for something, anything that might alleviate my ennui or titillate my idle brain. The family library had a few things that might distract me. My father was a pretty interesting guy, a native California and very un-Nebraskan. He valued education and wanted his sons to cherish books, so recently purchased a new set of World Book Encyclopedia to display next to a few old sets of matched volumes of literature. I figured the encyclopedia would be too much like homework, so I turned my attention to the old 20-volume set of the world's greatest literature. At first glance, The Last of the Mohegans looked like it might be fun, but I soon discovered it was too grown up and difficult. I finally settled on Volume 8 of the series, Tales of Mystery and Imagination by Edgar Allan Poe. I opened it up and saw to my delight it was a collection of short stories that had titles that were absolutely irresistible to a miserable 9-year-old boy. The Premature Burial, The Mask of the Red Death, The Telltale Heart. Premature burials and red deaths sounded very promising indeed, but back in California I had actually seen a terrifying cartoon called The Telltale Heart at the old Lakewood Theater. I recalled at the time my mother became very upset with my older brother for taking little Lonnie to see such a disturbing and adult film. I poured myself a glass of buttermilk. I plopped down in the big chair by the open window and opened the book. Once I started to read, however, I was way out of my depth. There were lots of big words and incomprehensible foreign language phrases and epigrams and geographic references. Every other sentence seemed to make reference to some ancient legend or myth or classic poem. I was forced to actually use the dictionary and the encyclopedia just to plod my way through the first story, The Pit and the Pendulum. But I eventually did get through it. And after I closed the book, I realized I had become somebody else. Someone I liked. Someone who could use the dictionary and the encyclopedia. I learned about the horrors of the Spanish Inquisition. Oh, how delightfully evil was that! And I was exposed for the first time to the melodically elegant use of the English language. Most importantly, I discovered I was capable of being touched by art, capable of being possessed by passion. My ennui lifted and was replaced by a pre-adolescent worship of the macabre and the genius and wit of its creators. This passion has yet to subside. I spent the rest of that summer with Poe and the dictionary and the World Book Encyclopedia. Ironically, the same 19th century-esque liabilities that I despised about 1950 Nebraska, 50s Nebraska, excuse me, the same liabilities in life proved to be priceless assets of the atmosphere that allowed me to conjure the perfect reading environment to save the ecstasy of classic horror. horror takes its time. To properly appreciate it, you must also take your time. It has a pace, a slow, incessant rhythm, like your own heartbeat, like your own breath. After all, the great innovators of the arts were writers of the Gilded Age who wrote for 19th and 20th century audience. Nebraska in 1957 definitely had both her feet firmly planted in the 19th and early 20th century. That summer morning in 1957 could just as easily been 1857, accompanied by the same soundtrack of bucolic silence, the same light searing through the same sun-stained yellow window shades. No hint of modern objective reality. No diversions of bustling civilization. No diversions of airplanes roaring overhead. No freeways in the distance. No sirens, no television, no radio, no air conditioner. Only the white noise of a million cicadas and the hiss of my own blood running through my brain. The incessant swing of the pendulum of an ancient clock. The barking of a distant dog. The cawing of a crow. The almost imperceptible whisper of the delicate film of curtains as they billow gently toward me like the gossamer negligee of a lovesick ghost. This was the background music of my honeymoon with horror, playing as the honey-sweet words of Edgar Allan Poe lugubriously wove elegant phrases from the age of gilded manners into a symphony of tortured rapture. Only had I been obliged to read the yellowing pages by the light of a whale oil lamp, could my anachronistic reading experience be more exquisitely atmospheric. I was so lucky. Today, most of us find it almost impossible to recapture the sepia-toned world that best conducts horror from the page to the soul. 21st century readers, spoiled by spectacular special effects of the cinema, demand from the written word instant gratification, explosive shocks, and gore-splattered attacks upon the senses. We no longer allow ourselves time to refine our rapture. We wolf down junk food snacks of violence and carnage when, just with a little patience, we could leisurely savor a rich and soul-satisfying banquet of elegant horror. We are missing so much. Okay, it goes on, of course, but that's all we're going to do for today, because I think we've come to our time. Okay, our time is up for today. Hopefully I'll be back tomorrow with another little surprise. I hope you enjoyed this, and will be with me again tomorrow. In the meantime, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law. Love under will.